Hello! Welcome to New Scientist Weekly, your curated selection of the week's science stories. I'm Timothy Revel in London.
And I'm Christy Taylor in New York. This week on the podcast, how chickens seem to have a precursor to language, a Nobel Prize-winning biologist on whether it's possible to halt the aging process, and why time is a quantum illusion. You heard me.
And if that wasn't enough, we'll also be talking about how seaweed could be used to mine the rare earth elements we need for the green energy revolution. But first, over the last week we've seen several funny, or depending on your point of view, harrowing stories about the output of Google's new AI search engine, which uses a large language model to summarize information relevant to your search. But it doesn't always work that well, and some of the more notable gaffes include suggestions from the AI that people should eat rocks for a healthy diet, delicious, and that petrol can be used to spice up pasta dishes, also delicious. Yum. Those recommendations were clearly and obviously misinformation, but it won't always be so easy to tell. Our technology reporter Matthew Sparks has been following the news this week. Hi, Matt.
Hi there, Tim.
So, Matt, talk us through it all. What's actually going on?
Well, we've known for months that all the big search engines have been working on adding AI features. And this month, Google introduced what it calls AI overviews. Instead of responding to a query with a list of relevant websites like Google's always done before, it now gives you a bespoke written response. And as you've heard, it's not always doing very well. In fact, sometimes it's doing really badly.
Feels like at least part of this story is that Google has been playing catch up on AI since the release of ChatGPT. And perhaps really what we're seeing here is it's shipping a product a little too soon. What do the people at Google say about it? Are they going to roll it back? Are they going to change it?
Well, Google said nothing to us. I've asked what the plan is in the wake of these problems, and we've received no response at all. The company did issue a statement to others saying that these funny examples we've seen, they're not representative of what most people's experiences are. And that might be true, but these sorts of mistakes, they don't need to be numerous to have a really big impact in the wrong situation. You can imagine someone looking for medical advice, for instance. At best, they could get useless advice. At worst, they could get really dangerous advice, which would make their situation much worse. Really, these problems, they either need to be fixed or the tool needs to be taken offline, or the third option, which doesn't feel ideal, is that it is just allowed to carry on.
We've heard and seen examples for months, years even, that large language models hallucinate. They make things up. They don't understand the context of what they're being asked. Is that the same old problem here?
Yeah, exactly. Google's AI search is being powered by a large language model, and that's trained on text taken from the internet. So it's inherited all the bias of the humans that wrote that text, and it's also learned all the nonsense that's been written online. And on occasion, it's just parroting that back as if it's true or sensible. So people have traced back one of the ideas. The search engine suggested that people could stick cheese to pizza with glue. That's been traced back to a tongue-in-cheek Reddit post made over a decade ago. So you can tell that Google's search engine isn't aware that that was a joke. It's got no concept that makes no sense in the real world, or that it could be dangerous. In that instance, you'd hope that people reading the suggestion would understand that it's a daft idea. But it just goes to show basically that you can't trust the output of these models, perhaps even when it appears more sensible than these suggestions we're talking about.
Yeah, I can think of plenty of real-world situations where the thing you're supposed to do isn't necessarily intuitive or something you would know, just from looking at, ChatGPT output, that you're being told the wrong thing. So are there any suggestions that Google's search can be fixed? What do AI researchers say?
Yeah, there's numerous techniques that could offer a fix. Experts told me that there's things like retrieval augmented generation, which could work. That's where the output isn't entirely generated by AI, from its own internal neural network, which was trained on text, but it's partially based on searching a database of known facts, which is a lot like search engines used to work. Now, some search engines that work that way do exist, and they try their best to cite facts and link through to sources. So if you asked about how AI works, it might paraphrase one of our articles on New Scientist, but it would always tell you where it got that information from, so you could sort of click through and check it. But the general feeling I get from experts is that Google's locked into this AI arms race with all the other startups and big technology companies. They're having to please shareholders by rolling out ever more impressive models. And these sorts of RAG search engines that point to sources. It's just a bit boring, you know?
And yet, from a user perspective, it feels like a search engine with citations is exactly what we'd prefer. So often when searching, you just want to get to a website or an answer, and these LLM explanations, I feel, tend to be making that a bit harder. What do you think's going to happen next? Where is this all going?
It's really hard to say at the moment, but certainly generative models, they're being introduced to all sorts of software, search engines, services that all of us use daily. And, you know, they do appear impressively capable, but we see time and time again that they don't understand context. They've got no real concern about facts. They simply make things up. So it does feel like we're trusting them to do a lot of jobs that they simply aren't up to yet.
Next up, I have a question for you. What kind of shape do you imagine when you hear the word kiki? That's right, kiki. Just think for a second, hold that in your mind. And now, what do you think about when you hear the word bouba? Think about bouba and a shape. All right, got them both? Great. If kiki evokes a sharp or pointy shape in your mind, and if bouba makes you think of a round or bubbly shape, then you are in line with the majority of people, regardless of what language they speak. Now, new research has found that baby chicks experience much the same thing. Chen Lai is here with the details. Hey, Chen.
Hi.
Okay, so first of all, tell us a little bit more about this bouba kiki effect that seems to happen in people's brains.
Yeah, so just like you said, it's a phenomenon where people associate the nonsense word bouba with a round shape and kiki with sharp shapes. Lots of studies over the past couple of decades have found that the phenomenon holds true for the vast majority of people, not just across languages, but as you said, but also across ages and cultures, so pretty much everyone. It's an example of what we call sound symbolism, this kind of spontaneous association between certain sounds and shapes, and it's thought to be a potential precursor to human language. The fact that this effect is so universal has led to some psychologists to wonder if it's a uniquely human experience or whether it's a more innate characteristic of all animals.
And that's where the baby chicks come in, right? They ask the chickens to think about shapes.
Yeah, exactly. So to test out just how instinctive the bouba kiki effect is, researchers decided to put 42 3-day-old chicks to the test. If you picture them at this age, you know, they're very fluffy and small, and they're kind of the ideal test subjects because they hatch with pretty much fully developed motor, visual, and nervous systems. That means we can test them as soon as they hatch and control all the things that they're exposed to. Each chick was placed into a small arena with 2 panels, one with an image of a spiky shape and one with a round shape. A recording of someone saying the word bouba or kiki was played on a speaker close by, and the chicks were able to wander around freely.
And are we then expecting that the chicks would go to the shape that matches whichever audio they were exposed to?
Yeah, exactly. And that is precisely what they found. Overall, the chicks were much more likely to approach the panel with the spiky shape when kiki was played in the background, and much more likely to approach the round shape when they heard bouba.
That's really quite surprising. I mean, I'm just generally impressed that this is something chicks can pick up on, but you also said earlier that it may be a kind of precursor to language. So what should we take from this result? Was Chicken Run actually more of a documentary than we realized?
That is a really good question. And obviously chickens don't have complex language in the same way we do. But in terms of evolution, being able to link certain sounds with specific shapes or symbols might actually help animals make sense and explore their surroundings, and even make some predictions about the world. For example, they might associate the sound of a predator with their shape, which they might see in the background, and they know to stay away. The findings of this specific study shows that the bouba kiki effect may not be unique to people, and therefore not driven by speech or language. It may be in fact driven by kind of more automatic, instinctive associations that we experience in response to the world around us.
Amazing. So the chickens are telling us something about ourselves.
Exactly.
Every week, we look for the most important, interesting stories from the world of science and technology news. But we also want to introduce you to some of the amazing scientists who think deeply about the biggest questions there are. On next week's Culture Lab, we talk to one such person, astronomer Lisa Kaltenegger, who spends her days wondering how alien life would look if it evolved on a very different planet from our own.
That'll be right here in this feed coming Tuesday. And we've got something special for our US-based listeners coming this summer. If you're someone who likes mind-blowing ideas, the latest from the frontiers of science, and you've always wanted to understand human consciousness, then we've got an event for you.
As I say, come on down to a special day-long event that's all about the latest research, theory, and understanding of how our brains do the seeming magic of sentience. You'll meet and learn from leading experts in neuroscience and philosophy, hear about groundbreaking new research, and come away, we promise, more conscious than ever before. That's on June 22nd, just a few weeks away in New York City. For more information, visit newscientist.com/New York Mind.
Now we turn to the problem of time. I'm not talking about losing track of it or not having enough of it. Instead, I'm talking about what it even is. Because it's so fundamental to how we experience the world, it should really be an easy thing to explain, but as is often the case, the closer you look at it, the harder it becomes. And now, some physicists have come to the rather shocking conclusion that time itself is just an illusion that emerges from quantum properties of the universe. Yeah, I'm scratching my head too. To help unpick this, we've got our intrepid physics reporter, Carmela Padovich-Callahan. Hi, Carmela.
Hello.
Carmela, are you here today, tomorrow, yesterday, or is this all just an illusion?
I mean, I love to live in one unchanging static universe where time is just still at all times.
So say we all.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So you and I both have been to physics labs in our careers, and it's not unusual to see a clock on the wall. And in fact, often good experiments rely on getting good time measurements. So, what gives? Could time really just be an illusion? Why are physicists saying this now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. Even if you've never been to a physics lab, you may have heard scientists talk about timing parts of their experiments or even building clocks. So you would really think that if they are using time so much, they would know a lot about it. But if you sort of zoom all the way out from just one lab or just one experiment and try to look at the world through the eyes of a theorist who wants to find a consistent way to explain, everything, sort of put all of the pieces of our physical reality into one consistent theory, time is in real trouble in that bigger picture. Specifically, the way we model the world right now is that we have two theories that work extremely well, one for very large objects and one for very small objects. And this is general relativity and quantum mechanics. And sometimes they meet. But even if they don't meet, if you just try to stitch them together into one whole thing, the fact that they treat time very differently makes it sort of impossible to get a theory of the whole universe that will work at any scale.
So famously in general relativity, space and time are one thing called space-time. It's a kind of four-dimensional continuum that's the backdrop to the universe. But remind me, what's the situation in quantum mechanics? Is it really that different?
Yeah, it's super different. As you say, in general relativity, time is part of space-time, and space-time is this sort of fabric of reality, and you can stretch it, and you can warp it, and you can contract it. It changes. So time is dynamic, and it's always there in the theory. You have to have it. In quantum mechanics, time is much more of an external static thing. It really only enters into discussion when an experimenter looks at a clock. It's sort of undisturbed by anything else that happens in the experiment. You can't dilate it. You can't sort of perturb what time is in the same way that you can in relativity.
All right. But the story this week is that you found some researchers who think that time isn't actually this sort of separate external phenomenon. Instead, it actually emerges out of quantum phenomena, right? So how does that work? Please tell me.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely fascinating because it's kind of an old idea. So we have to go back to 1983 when theorists Don Page and William Wooders suggested that whenever you see a system evolving in time, sort of when you see something changing and give you a sense of the passage of time, that really comes from that system being quantum entangled with something that is tick and talking like a clock. So what they were saying all the way back in the 1980s is that there's no such thing as a standalone, independently existing time. And actually, if you are not entangled with something clock-like, this theory will tell you that everything will be static and unchanging, as I was joking about before. So, jokes or no jokes, this theory raises the real possibility that time is not external. It's emergent from within the entangled system, and that's all it is. It just comes from the entanglement.
I find that really shocking. And I'm also like trying to figure out like where the clock I'm, entangled with is. I'm looking around the room. But, the idea that without quantum entanglement, we just have like an unchanging present makes me more grateful than I thought I ever would be for entanglement. And, as you write, this is more than a theory now. You reported on a new study with data that supports such an idea just this week. How do you get data that sort of points to this?
Right. So I think maybe we can cool down a little bit on what we mean when we say data, right?
Sure.
We're sort of talking about a mathematical investigation where some theorists said, let's take this old idea and can we sort of do the math for some objects that actually exist? So a collection of magnets, a harmonic oscillator, which is kind of like a spring. What if you consider these objects, which we know how to model, where we have good math, can we then plug them into this framework and say, will the math work out? Like, can we assume that time comes from entanglement and still get equations that make sense from what we know about these systems? And basically what they showed is that if you start with the two systems entangled and one of them is like a clock, then the equations you get actually are the equations that you would always use to predict what will happen in the future, right? So even if they looked at a classical system, not just where everything is quantum, they could kind of get back the kind of math that you would learn in school. The entanglement assumption, the assumption about time being emergent, actually gave us back exactly what we would expect. And this worked for things that were tiny, like an atom, and have to play by quantum rules, or something that is, like an orange that you can roll on the table and will always do Newtonian things. So they really, with like big generality, showed that the math at least works out, even if you swap our regular sense of time for this emergent quantum time.
Amazing. So if I want to stop my vegetables from going bad before I can eat them, I just need to find a way to disentangle them from their clocks.
Super easy.
So easy.
One weird trick to save money on vegetables.
So I'm just getting my head around this. Effectively, this team is saying that the whole world is quantum, whether we can tell or not. And any time we encounter time, it is because of the quantumness. And that is a pretty cool realization. So what does that do for this possible theory of everything, uniting big and small physics alike that you mentioned before?
Yeah, I think that's sort of the most exciting part of this, because if you can sort of say like, well, time works because it comes from quantum entanglement and we perceive time, so there must be a lot of entanglement all around us, then you kind of have a way to say like, okay, even if I go to the scales where I have to use general relativity, my time will still come from something quantum, and now you've opened the door to connect the two theories that we thought that we couldn't connect before. But there are so many more details that have to be ironed out before we can say something definitive. For instance, the team didn't address what happens when the clock and the other objects interact. And interactions between objects are something we encounter in the real world all the time. So if you wanted to experimentally test this theory, or if you wanted to talk about gravity in particular, you would probably have to account for those interactions. So more ingredients need to be added into this theory.
Up next, aging is, at least so far, an inevitable part of being alive. But many researchers over the decades have asked why that is and how it works, and whether we might be able to stop the aging process altogether. Now, a new book from Nobel Prize-winning biologist Venki Ramakrishnan examines the weight of the evidence and what the future may hold. Our reporter Graham Lawton spoke to him all about it.
We have worried about aging and death ever since we were humans. But for most of our existence as a species, there was very little we could do about it. But I think because of the tremendous advances in biology over the last few decades, we now have tools and a sort of level of knowledge to actually think about what causes aging and what could we do to either ameliorate it or postpone it.
Were there any big scientific surprises for you when you were researching the book?
Yeah, I came with a very critical view, and I felt that lifespan is probably fixed and it's a result of, inevitable process of time and entropy. But actually, having read the literature and having, thought about it, and also the evolutionary basis, so I've changed my view. So many people who are not in the field think that aging is programmed, that it serves a purpose, perhaps renewal of the species and so on. But it turns out most evolutionary biologists don't think aging is programmed. They think that there's simply no mechanism to select against aging, because all evolution cares about is that we live long enough to reproduce and, take care of our offspring until they're grown up. Okay, and beyond that, we're sort of dispensable as far as our genes go. So there's been no selection mechanism. And on the contrary, there are genes that help us when we're young. Maybe they allow us to grow faster, make us more fertile or virile, and perhaps healthier in younger age. But those very same genes cause us to age later on. And some of these genes have to do with preventing cancer too early in life. And the flip side is that we age. And so this balance in evolution, which determines lifespan, it's also the reason why species have very different lifespans, because they face very different evolutionary and environmental risks.
So the book adheres quite closely to the classic Hallmarks of Aging paper from 2013, Linda Partridge et al., and there was a revised version of that. So one of the explicit claims in the Hallmarks papers is we now understand aging sufficiently that we can start thinking about intervening.
Yes, I think that's a fair comment. For example, there's DNA damage, there's telomere loss, there's, proteostasis and nutrient sensing, which has to do with restricting calories, for example, and that its effect on aging. So all these metabolic changes with aging, and then the effect of aging on the immune system and on inflammation. So as we start to understand the biological basis of these, people are actually trying to intervene. And, one very exciting area is stem cell regeneration and cellular reprogramming in general. I think, DNA damage, everybody agrees, is a fundamental cause of aging. But, so far, DNA repair and therapeutics targeted at that have really gone mostly to address cancer rather than aging. But some of the more promising areas you mentioned are, affecting the TOR pathway or the IGF-1 pathway, this insulin-like growth factor pathway. So these metabolic pathways, indirectly, they will affect aging or slow down aging. And in fact, some of the early mutants that they found that even double lifespan in worms affect this insulin growth hormone pathway. And it provides a kind of biological or biochemical explanation for a long-standing observation that if you calorically restrict animals, that which is you provide them just enough calories so that they don't get malnourished, just enough to survive, those mice tend to live longer. And people have found the same effect in fruit flies and worms and, variety of species. So it seems to be a promising approach. Now, of course, nobody likes caloric restriction. Even these mice, as soon as you stop caloric restriction, they start gorging again on food. So it might be easier to take a pill that has the same effect as these caloric restriction pathways. But that's actually, we're nowhere near that.
Another thing that you're a little bit less enthusiastic about than some other people in this area is this concept of compression of morbidity, where the age-related diseases kick in later, but kick in more around the age of 80 or so. So people spend longer in good health and then have a short period of morbidity at the end. But you don't seem to think that that's panning out quite as some people might say.
Well, okay. The concept is you live extremely healthy for most of your life, and then you suddenly, everything fails and you die, okay? And the problem is that every single thing that we've done to ameliorate some of the problems of aging, for example, heart disease can be thought of as a problem of aging, cancer is correlated with aging, all these things, high blood pressure, stroke, etc. All these things that we've addressed have actually increased our lifespan. And the result of these advances is we're not spending a larger fraction of our lives healthy. We're living longer healthily, but we're living even longer unhealthily. So the fraction hasn't changed. So we're actually living more years with sort of morbidities of old age. And we're sort of living with them. We have our arthritis, we have possibly have dementia, we have, all sorts of chronic ailments. And so this idea that we're going to, I think Rick Klausner said, the goal is to die young after a very long time. You're young, youthful all your life, and then suddenly you die. Well, my question to these people is, if you're youthful, everything's working great, why would you suddenly die? And why would you expect that everything would just collapse at the same time, So I think these are, I'm not saying it's impossible theoretically, but I think it's a highly complex problem, and we're nowhere near understanding.
You talk about all these vast sums of money pouring, like some of it private capital, pouring into anti-aging research, and that's essentially a sort of first world problem. There are much more pressing issues from a humanitarian perspective. Where would you put that money?
I do talk about that as well, and I point out that of all the billionaires, Bill Gates stands out as an exception, because he realizes that the best way to improve global longevity is to tackle all these diseases in the third world, which are mostly often affecting children, So I think as someone who grew up in India, I do think this sort of mania to live longer, it's just a first world problem. And I think there are so many more important problems: infectious diseases, chronic diseases, malnutrition, food security, climate change, and what that does to our health and food. Those are all much more pressing problems. We live twice as long now as we did, over 100 years ago. Are people today really more creative or even more prolific than Mozart or Beethoven or Charles Darwin or Isaac Newton or any of those people? I don't think so. So I think at some level, we should aim to live healthily for as long as we can, but then we've got to accept our mortality as just part of of the grand scheme of things.
That was New Scientist's Graham Lawton in conversation with the Nobel Prize-winning biologist Venki Ramakrishnan. You can find the text of the full interview on our website at newscientist.com.
Up next, the transition away from fossil fuels has led to a rush for new sources of minerals needed to build green technologies. Think batteries, solar panels, the like. And all that has meant an expansion of mining. But in many cases, that mining comes with serious environmental and social consequences. But what if we could collect these minerals via a much less harmful process? Reporter James Deneen is here to tell us about how seaweed may be a useful tool for gathering minerals directly from ambient seawater. I don't know why I'm saying these words, but James, you're going to tell us why?
Yes, hello.
Amazing. So this week you wrote about researchers who think we may be able to use seaweed to essentially mine for some of these minerals that are so essential for clean energy. How would that work?
So some species of seaweed, also known as macroalgae, are known to accumulate high concentrations of some of these valuable minerals, specifically several of the rare earth elements used to make the powerful magnets in wind turbines and many other electronics. And these rare earth elements are present in seawater at extremely low concentrations, but if the seaweed can accumulate them at a high enough concentration, it might be possible to harvest the seaweed and then extract the rare earth from their tissue.
I notice you say if, which is a big little two-letter word. So what are some of the unknowns around this idea? I take it we haven't actually figured out whether seaweed is actually going to collect our rare earth minerals for us.
Yeah, so lots of ifs here. The field of biomining in general with plants or microbes has been around for a while, but the idea to use seaweed is a really new and still basically untested idea. However, researchers at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory have shown in the lab that some species of seaweed can hyperaccumulate some of these rare earth elements. That means they can concentrate them at least 1 million times above background levels. This works because some of the sugar molecules made by the seaweed are negatively charged and attached to specific positively charged rare earths.
Neat.
All that work is in a lab, but it isn't clear if seaweed can do this in the ocean, and if they can, which species and where. There are also questions about how to extract and purify these elements from the tissue and do it all in a way that is economically viable. And then even if all that does work, it's not as though seaweed mining could ever produce enough minerals to replace conventional mining. No one's really saying that, but it could offer an alternative source to complement it. And there are other good reasons to farm seaweed as well, like to remove CO2 from the atmosphere or as a source of biofuel or food.
Yeah, it seems like those lab experiments and then the potential benefits it could have are all lots of reasons to look into this a bit more. How far along is the idea? Are there lots of different researchers looking at it?
Yeah, so there are a few teams of researchers at the moment supported by the U.S. Department of Energy. The U.S. government is really interested in this idea as a way to reduce its dependence on China and a few other countries that dominate the supply chains for these minerals. One group from the University of Alaska Fairbanks is working in the waters around a place called Bocon Mountain in the southeast part of the state. The mountain has a rich reserve of rare earth that washes off into the surrounding waters to create a high concentration there. And the team is surveying seaweed species there to see what they are accumulating. And they told me they plan to begin farming seaweed there as soon as this year, once they've identified which species are the best hyperaccumulators. There's also a food company called Umaro Foods that makes a bacon alternative from seaweed, and they're exploring ways to extract the rare earth while still being able to use the rest of the seaweed biomass for food or other things.
So I guess maybe one day we'll be talking about frying seaweed bacon on an electric induction stove built out of magnets extracted from seaweed. Pretty amazing.
One day it might be.
The dream.
One thing I'm really curious about is if we know why these seaweeds concentrate the rare earth elements in the first place, is there kind of a cool evolutionary story behind this, some benefit for them? Why would they do it?
It's a really good question, but the researchers I spoke with said we still really aren't sure whether these hyperaccumulating species of seaweed benefit from doing it or whether it's just an accident of their biology. In any case, it could be good news for the planet.
One last thing before we go. This weekend, China's Chang'e 6 moonlander will attempt to land on the far side of the moon. It's been orbiting for most of the last month while waiting for optimal light conditions at the landing site. And most excitingly, this lander's mission is to collect the first ever samples from the side of the moon that we never see from Earth. So good luck, little space robot. We hope it all goes well.
I'll be holding my breath and crossing all my fingers and toes. That's it for this week. You can read all the stories we've talked about today in the show notes, and there's much more like it on our website, newscientist.com.
Plus, if you like the great stories we're bringing you, please give us a rating or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It really does make a difference. Share your favorite stories with all your friends, or just send them to the moon for a robot to collect later. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.